I was 25 years old, fresh out of university, and the world felt at once huge and impossibly close. Landing my first proper job was more than just employment. It was proof to myself that I could stand on my own, finally step away from the sheltered life of classrooms, lecture halls, and my parents' constant guidance. Walking into the office on that first day, clutching a folder too tightly, I felt a mixture of pride and a deep nervous energy I couldn't quite shake. The company was bigger than anything I had imagined. Sleek glass doors, a reception desk that seemed to shine under soft lights, and employees who walked with confidence, tapping away at their phones as though they were carrying the world in their pockets. I felt out of place at first, adjusting my tie nervously, repeating to myself that I had earned this, that I had worked hard for this chance. The first week was a blur of handshakes, polite smiles, and the overwhelming flood of information. Processes, projects, expectations. People moved quickly, and I often found myself struggling to keep up, though I pretended otherwise. Yet, amid the chaos, my eyes were always drawn to one man, the CEO. He was everything I thought success looked like: poised, sharp, commanding without ever raising his voice. When he entered a room, it was as though the air shifted, everyone straightening automatically. I admired him silently, keeping my distance, not daring to imagine he even knew my name. Despite the intimidating atmosphere, there was kindness hidden in small places. A colleague offering to show me how to work the internal software, another inviting me for lunch. Still, my heart beat differently each time I realized I was the youngest, the newest, the one who knew the least. At home, I would replay the day in my head, wondering if I had said something foolish, if my eagerness was too obvious. Just when I thought I might sink under the pressure, news spread through the office like a spark through dry grass. The CEO had decided to host a party at his farmhouse. People whispered about it with excitement, about the sprawling lawns, the swimming pool, the food, and the fact that such an invitation was rare. It wasn't just a party, it was an acknowledgement, a chance to belong, to be seen. My heart leapt at the idea, but nerves tangled with it instantly. What would I wear? How would I behave? I had never been to such gatherings before, not one hosted by someone of his stature, not one that mixed work with pleasure. I imagined laughter around me while I stood awkwardly with a drink in hand, out of place again. Still, beneath the worry was a flicker of hope. Maybe this was my chance to learn how to blend in, to become more than just the quiet new graduate sitting at the edge of meetings. I could already hear my mother's voice in my head: "Don't waste opportunities. People don't remember who hides in the corner, they remember who dares to step forward." As the days counted down to the party, the office buzzed with preparation. Conversations circled around what people planned to wear, who would bring their families, and the games rumored to be set up near the pool. Each time the farmhouse was mentioned, I felt my stomach tighten. I told myself it was excitement, though deep down I knew it was also fear. Fear of exposing how inexperienced I truly was in these spaces. The morning of the party, I stood before my mirror longer than usual. My reflection looked both familiar and foreign. A young man trying to mold himself into someone confident, someone who could carry himself without hesitation. I kept reminding myself that no one expected perfection from me, that maybe, just maybe, I could go, observe, and let the evening carry me without overthinking every move. As I left home, the sun was sinking into a warm horizon, the city buzzing with its usual life. I could feel a quiet shift inside me, the knowledge that tonight wasn't just another event. It was a test of sorts, not one of knowledge or performance but of presence, of finding my place among people who seemed larger than life. And though the thought of stepping into that world unsettled me, a part of me was undeniably eager. Somewhere between the nerves and the anticipation, I held on to one simple truth: I was still learning, still growing. Perhaps tonight would be another chapter in that journey, one that would surprise me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The drive to the farmhouse felt longer than it was. A small convoy of cars left the city together, carrying clusters of colleagues who seemed more relaxed outside the office than they ever did within its walls. I sat in the back seat of one of the cars, quiet, letting the breeze from the half-open window cool my restless thoughts. When the tall iron gates of the farmhouse finally came into view, opening slowly as if revealing some hidden world, a collective murmur of awe rose in the car. The place was unlike anything I had ever seen up close. A long driveway curved through rows of trimmed hedges, leading to a sprawling white house with tall windows and balconies that looked like something out of a magazine. Warm lights glowed from the inside, spilling across the wide porch where waiters in crisp uniforms stood ready with trays. Beyond the house stretched a vast garden dotted with fairy lights strung between trees. And in the center of it all, glistening under spotlights, was the swimming pool, blue, inviting, reflecting the night sky like a mirror. People spilled out of cars with laughter, their voices carrying through the night air. Some rushed straight toward the poolside where tables were set with drinks, while others gathered in small groups across the lawn, already slipping into the comfort of casual conversation. I followed slowly, taking in every detail, feeling like I had stepped into a dream far removed from the clutter of city apartments I was used to. Inside the house, music drifted softly, mingling with the hum of chatter. I watched as colleagues I only ever saw hunched over laptops now laughed freely, glasses in hand, their stiff office personas replaced by something more human. It was strange and comforting all at once. The CEO moved among them effortlessly, greeting everyone with that same calm authority he carried in meetings, but here it felt warmer, more personal. When he passed near me and gave a brief nod, I felt my heart leap as though I had been recognized in a way I hadn't expected. Despite the beauty of the setting and the buzz of conversation, I couldn't shake my awkwardness. I stood near the edge of groups, smiling politely, listening more than speaking. My seniors swapped stories about projects and travels, sometimes slipping into jokes that had histories I didn't yet share. A few tried to draw me in kindly, asking about my background, my family, how I was settling into the company, and though I answered as best I could, there was always a small voice inside me reminding me that I was the youngest, the newest, still finding my place. Gradually, though, the atmosphere began to loosen its grip on my nerves. Someone offered me a drink, another clapped me on the shoulder and insisted I join a game happening on the lawn. I laughed at a joke and it didn't feel forced this time. For brief moments, I felt almost as though I belonged, carried by the easy flow of the evening. It was then, standing near the pool with a plate of snacks in hand, that I noticed him. The peon, our office helper. In the office he was the one who brought files, fetched tea, swept unnoticed in corners while everyone worked. Here, in the glow of the farmhouse lights, he looked almost out of place, dressed in plain clothes that were neat but far from the polished suits and dresses around him. His face was ordinary, lined with the wear of daily labor, but his eyes were sharp, observant. I realized after a few minutes that those eyes were on me. Not in the way of casual glances shared in crowded rooms, but steady, deliberate. Wherever I shifted, whatever group I lingered near, I could feel his gaze brushing against me. At first I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was my imagination, the product of nerves still unsettled from the day. But when I risked another glance across the pool, there he was, his gaze fixed again, unreadable. I felt a prickling unease at the back of my neck. Why would he watch me like that? I barely knew him beyond polite greetings, and even those were rare. He was older, reserved, someone who never spoke much unless spoken to. The idea of him observing me so intently stirred something uncomfortable. Still, I brushed it off with a shaky laugh at another colleague's story. Perhaps he was simply lost in thought and I happened to be in his line of sight. Perhaps he was curious about the younger staff, or about how different people acted outside the office walls. I told myself not to overthink, not to let suspicion sour an evening that, against my fears, was slowly turning enjoyable. The night deepened, the poolside alive with chatter and splashes as a few daring ones dove into the water fully clothed. Lights sparkled off the surface, laughter echoed across the lawn, and music from inside swelled as more people joined the dance floor. I allowed myself to breathe, to take in the beauty of the farmhouse and the rare chance to see the human side of those I worked with. Yet, every so often I found myself glancing back toward where he stood, silent, still, his eyes always seeming to return to me. Each time I forced myself to look away, convincing myself it meant nothing. After all, this was a celebration, and I was determined not to ruin it with unnecessary worries. Even so, a question lingered quietly in the back of my mind as the night wore on. What did he see in me that kept his gaze so steady? The pool was the heart of the party, glowing under the soft white and blue lights strung around its edges. Music pulsed faintly from the house, but out here the sound of splashing water and bursts of laughter dominated. A few of the younger staff were already diving in, their cheers echoing through the open night air, while others dangled their legs into the shallow end, sipping drinks as though the water itself were another luxury offered by the farmhouse. For a long while I stood back watching. I had never been much of a swimmer. Pools and parties like this belonged to another world, one I had only ever glimpsed in movies or heard about from classmates who came from wealthier families. The idea of stepping in, of showing my clumsy strokes in front of seniors who seemed to glide effortlessly, filled me with hesitation. But then someone noticed me lingering and called out with a grin, "Come on, don't just stand there. Join us." Others joined in, their playful insistence making it harder to refuse. I forced a smile, placing my glass aside, and nodded. My footsteps felt heavier than they should as I walked toward the changing room. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with chlorine. I changed quickly into my swimming suit, staring at my reflection in the small mirror. You'll be fine, I told myself. No one's watching you that closely. Just enjoy it. Blend in. When I stepped back outside and dipped a tentative foot into the water, the shock of the cold made me gasp. A colleague laughed and splashed me deliberately, and before I could retreat, another pulled me in with a playful shove. The water swallowed me, cool and sharp against my skin, and I surfaced sputtering to a chorus of laughter. Somehow the sound didn't feel mocking, it felt shared, light-hearted. I laughed too, and for a moment my nerves dissolved into the rhythm of the evening. We swam in circles, splashing at one another, racing across the length of the pool with exaggerated strokes, cheering for whoever reached the far wall first. I wasn't the fastest, not even close, but no one seemed to care. Someone handed me a brightly colored inflatable ball, and soon we were tossing it across the water, shouting names, pretending it was a championship game. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, I felt as though the invisible wall between me and the others had thinned. But then, as I floated near the edge to catch my breath, I felt it again, the weight of a gaze pressing against me. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. And there he was. The peon stood at a distance near the poolside, his arms folded loosely, his stance casual. To anyone else, it might have seemed as though he were simply passing the time, watching the collective fun. But his eyes, they weren't wandering over the group. They were fixed on me, steady, unbroken. A chill prickled down my spine, sharper than the cold of the water. I forced my gaze away quickly, throwing myself back into the game with forced enthusiasm, splashing water at a colleague who teased me for looking too serious. Yet in the back of my mind, his eyes followed, relentless. Why is he staring? I thought, my strokes growing uneven as I swam across the pool again. Does he want something from me? Is there danger in that look, or is it something else entirely? No matter how I tried to drown the thought in laughter and noise, it returned each time I glanced toward the poolside. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't broken that quiet observation. My heart beat faster, though I smiled and joined in the fun as though nothing was wrong. At one point, a colleague leaned against me, laughing breathlessly, and said, "You're not bad at this for someone who looked like he'd never been in a pool before." I laughed too, shaking water from my hair, but my mind was far away, caught in the net of that unwavering stare. The games continued, growing rowdier as the night deepened. Someone cannonballed into the deep end, drenching those of us nearby. A group began chanting playful challenges, daring each other to dive or hold their breath underwater the longest. I played along, grateful for the distraction, but even when submerged with my eyes closed against the sting of chlorine, I could still feel it, that strange awareness that someone's eyes were on me alone. When I finally pulled myself out of the pool to rest, wrapping a towel around my shoulders, I tried not to look in his direction. Yet it was impossible to resist. My gaze flickered across the crowd and landed on him again. He was still there, quiet, almost expressionless, but his eyes burned with a kind of intent I couldn't understand. A nervous thought threaded its way through me. What if I'm not imagining this? What if he's waiting for a moment to corner me? My stomach tightened and the cool night air suddenly felt heavy. I tried to laugh it off, to remind myself that this was nothing, just my nerves inventing shadows where none existed. After all, he was only a peon, someone harmless, someone who had probably worked long hours today and was simply standing idle. But the longer his gaze lingered, the more impossible it became to dismiss. It haunted the corners of my mind, following me into every splash, every laugh, every attempt to convince myself that tonight was carefree. Even surrounded by joy and noise, a thread of unease pulled tight around me and I could not shake it. After nearly an hour in the pool, my body was exhausted, and the chill of the water had seeped into my skin. I decided it was time to step away and change into something dry before the night air made me shiver. Grabbing my towel and clothes, I slipped away from the crowd, toward the small building beside the pool where changing rooms had been set up. Inside, the air was quieter, insulated from the noise of laughter and splashing outside. The faint hum of distant music reached me, but here, alone, it felt almost too quiet. I set my clothes down on the wooden bench, untying the strings of my swimsuit, grateful for a few minutes of solitude. But then the door creaked open. I froze, half-turned, a strange instinct telling me that something was about to shift. My eyes darted to the doorway, and there he was. The peon. His figure filled the narrow space, his face unreadable, his gaze once again fixed on me. For a heartbeat I couldn't move. My mind flashed back to every glance he had thrown at me throughout the evening, every moment I had felt his eyes burn into me from across the pool. And now, here he was, following me into the privacy of this small room. My throat went dry and I could hear the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I took a step back, clutching the towel tighter against myself. Fear twisted through me, sharp and suffocating. He's going to do something. He followed me in here for a reason. Why else? My thoughts tumbled into chaos, filling the silence with imagined threats. The door shut softly behind him. For a moment he didn't speak, just stood there, and in that silence my fear multiplied. My palms grew clammy, my chest tight. I wondered if I should shout, but my voice seemed lodged in my throat, trapped. Then finally he said quietly, "Don't be afraid." The words startled me, not because they calmed me, but because they confirmed my suspicion that he had seen the fear written all over my face. I stared at him, searching for menace in his tone, but his eyes were oddly gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you," he continued, stepping further in. I'm like you think. I'm gay." For a moment I didn't understand. My mind, still tangled in panic, struggled to process his words. Gay. That was his confession? Not an attack, not a threat, but this? "I don't want anything bad," he said quickly, perhaps sensing the alarm still painted on my features. "I've had pain in my back for days. Real pain. I can't sleep at night. I saw you and I thought maybe you would help me. Just a massage. Nothing else." From his pocket, he pulled out a small bottle of oil, holding it out like proof of his sincerity. The bottle glistened under the dim light, absurdly ordinary against the tension that had filled the room. I blinked at it, then back at him, my heart still racing but my fear beginning to shift into something else. Confusion, disbelief. Could it really be that simple? He had followed me not out of malice but desperation for relief? "I'm sorry if I scared you," he added quickly. "People, they don't usually listen to me. They laugh. They mock. If I ask for something like this, they make jokes. But you seem different. You don't treat people badly. That's why I thought maybe," his voice cracked slightly and he lowered his eyes, "maybe you would understand." I stood rooted to the spot, towel clutched tight, my chest rising and falling with the aftermath of panic. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, the dramatic fear I had built in my mind, unraveling into something so unexpected, so human. Another part of me felt guilty for having assumed the worst, for having painted him in the shadows of my imagination. My voice came out hoarse and I had to swallow before I could continue. "You followed me. I thought." "I know," he interrupted softly. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I just didn't know how else to ask. If I'd asked outside they would have laughed. Here at least, I could speak to you honestly." His vulnerability was disarming. Slowly my heartbeat steadied, the tightness in my chest loosening. I looked at the oil in his hand again, then back at his face. His eyes were tired, carrying not just the strain of physical pain but something deeper, older, the weight of being unseen, unheard. Cautiously I reached out and took the small bottle from him. He let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "I don't know if I'll be any good at this," I admitted, my voice steadier now. "But I'll try." His eyes lifted, and for the first time that night I saw something soften in them. Gratitude. He turned and sat on the bench, pulling his shirt over his head with a small wince. His back was lean, marked with the lines of labor, the kind of body built not by gyms but by years of carrying weight heavier than his share. As I poured a little oil into my palms, the sharp scent of eucalyptus filled the air. My hands hovered uncertainly before I pressed them gently against his shoulders. At first I was awkward, unsure of how much pressure to apply, where to press. But as he guided me with quiet words, a little lower, more firmly there, I found a rhythm. His muscles were tight, knotted with strain, and as I worked slowly I could feel them easing beneath my touch. "You're kind," he murmured after a while, his voice softer, almost drowsy. "Most people don't see me. I'm just the one who carries their things, cleans their mess. But you looked at me differently. Even in the office you don't throw words like others do." I didn't know what to say. My throat felt thick, a mixture of humility and shame. I had spent the evening fearing him, mistrusting his gaze, when all along he had been carrying not threat but loneliness. "Do they really mock you that much?" I asked quietly. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Every day. They call me names. Some whisper about what I am. They think I don't hear, but I do. It's easier to laugh with them, to pretend I don't care. But inside," he paused, sighing as though the words themselves carried weight. "Inside it breaks something." I pressed my hands more firmly against a knot in his shoulder, as if I could ease not just his muscles but the ache behind his words. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words spilling out without thought. "You don't deserve that." For a moment silence filled the room again, but it was a different silence than before. Not tense, not fearful, but heavy with the quiet sharing of something rarely spoken aloud. When I finally pulled my hands back, his back glistened faintly with oil, his shoulders looser, his breathing calmer. He turned slightly, enough for me to see the gratitude etched into his expression. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than their size. And standing there, still holding the bottle of oil, I felt a surprising swell of relief and something deeper, an understanding that had not existed between us before. The fear I had carried into this room had dissolved, replaced by a fragile but undeniable connection. For a while, the silence stretched between us, filled only by the faint hum of music outside and the sound of his slow, steady breathing. My hands rested against his back, warm with oil, still unsure if I was really doing any good. I hesitated, part of me wondering if I should stop, part of me oddly unwilling to break the fragile calm that had settled in this small room. "You don't have to keep going if you're uncomfortable," he murmured, his voice low. I almost pulled away then, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way his shoulders seemed lighter already, or maybe it was the crack of vulnerability I had glimpsed in him, something I had never expected to see. I shook my head, though he couldn't see it, and pressed my palms more firmly into the lines of tension along his spine. "It's fine," I said quietly. "I'll help." He let out a breath that sounded like relief, and then words began to spill from him in fragments, as though he had been holding them in for far too long. "I've been working here for almost 10 years, he said. 10 years of running after files, fetching tea, cleaning the same floors. People forget I have a name. To them I'm just peon. Sometimes they don't even look at me when they call me. Just snap their fingers like I'm less." His voice wavered and I felt something tighten in my chest. I pressed my thumbs gently along his shoulder blades, listening as he continued. "When I was younger I thought it wouldn't matter. Work is work, I told myself. As long as I earn enough to live, what people say doesn't matter. But it does. Every laugh, every whisper about how I walk, how I speak. They notice everything. And when they guess the truth, that I'm different, it got worse. They don't say it openly, but I can feel it. They laugh behind me, call me names when they think I can't hear." I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat almost painful. The oil was warm between my hands, but my chest felt cold with guilt. I had seen him so many times in the office, slipping in and out of rooms quietly, always on the periphery, and yet I had never truly looked. Not really. To me he had been what he said, just the peon. Invisible until needed. And now, here he was, unfolding a whole world of pain I had never bothered to imagine. "I'm sorry," I said softly. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. "I didn't realize it was like that for you." He gave a small shrug. "Why would you? Most people don't think about it. I don't blame them. I'm used to it by now. But it gets lonely. Being different, being laughed at, never being taken seriously. Sometimes I wonder if I'll spend my whole life being a shadow in other people's rooms." I didn't know what to say. My hands kept moving, pressing gently into the knots in his back, but my mind was racing. For the first time, I saw him not as a background figure in the office but as a man, human, fragile, carrying his own battles quietly. And in that moment the space between us shifted. He was no longer just the peon. He was someone whose pain was real, whose loneliness was sharp, whose dignity had been chipped away by 1,000 careless words. "You're not just a shadow," I said before I could stop myself. My voice was firmer this time. "You're more than they see. They're wrong not to treat you better." He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch the flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, maybe even gratitude. "You're kind," he said softly. "I knew you were different from the others. You never laughed when they joked about me. You never treated me like I wasn't there. That's why I asked you tonight. I thought, if anyone would understand, it would be you." The words sank deep into me, heavier than I expected. I thought back to my own place in the company, the youngest, the least experienced, still fumbling to prove myself. Most days I felt invisible too, though in a different way. People didn't mock me openly, but they looked past me, dismissing me as someone untested, someone without weight. In that quiet room I realized that though our struggles were different, the feeling was the same, the sting of not being seen for who you really were. "I know what it's like," I admitted quietly, my hands pausing before moving again. "Not the same as you, but to feel like you don't belong. To feel like you have to work twice as hard just to be noticed. I'm new here. I keep wondering if people think I'm a child pretending to play adult. Every day I go home wondering if I've embarrassed myself, if they're laughing at me when I'm not around." He was silent for a moment, as though weighing my words. Then he gave a small nod. "Yes," he murmured. "That's exactly it. Different reasons, same pain. You understand. I pressed my palms firmly along his back, but inside, something unknotted in me too. For the first time since joining the company, I felt like someone had truly heard me, even if that someone was the last person I had expected. The room no longer felt heavy. The fear that had gripped me when he first entered was gone, replaced by something quieter, almost tender. In the strange intimacy of that moment, we were no longer new graduate and peon, boss and servant. We were just two people, two souls carrying burdens, finding in each other a reflection of what it meant to be unseen, misunderstood, yet still hoping for kindness. When I finally stepped back, wiping my hands with the towel, he turned to face me. His expression was different now, softer, open in a way I had never seen. "Thank you," he said again, but this time his voice carried more weight. "Not just for the massage. For listening. For not laughing." I managed a small smile, though my throat was still tight. "Sometimes all people need is someone to see them," I said. And in his eyes I knew he understood. When our conversation lingered past the awkwardness, something inside me softened. I never expected a night that had begun with laughter by the pool and a faint shadow of suspicion in my heart would end here, in a quiet room, with me sitting on the wooden bench beside the peon, listening to him laugh for the first time in what seemed like years. His laughter wasn't the polished, restrained chuckle of my colleagues. It was raw, genuine, like the breaking of heavy clouds after a long storm. I caught myself smiling back. "You know," I said softly, "I didn't think I'd feel this comfortable. Not with you, not this soon." He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's because you don't judge me. Most people, they only see my uniform. Or worse, they see what they think I am. You didn't walk away." I didn't know what to reply at first, but instinctively I placed my hand lightly on his shoulder, the same one I had just massaged with oil. "I didn't walk away because you didn't mean me harm. You trusted me enough to tell me your truth, and that matters." For a moment, silence filled the room, not heavy but warm like an invisible blanket. Then he chuckled again and shook his head. "You're young, you know. Fresh in the company. Most people your age would have run out of here thinking I was crazy. Maybe I am crazy," I laughed with him. "But maybe the world needs a little crazy, at least the kind that believes in people." That made him quiet. He just kept looking at me as if weighing my words and then nodded slowly, almost reverently. "You'll go far in life. Not because of how smart you are, not even because of your degree. But because you see people for who they are." The simplicity of that praise struck me harder than all the polite compliments I had heard in the office. And maybe because it came from him, someone society might dismiss, someone invisible to most, it felt all the more precious. We ended up talking for what felt like hours, though it might have only been minutes. He told me small things, how he missed his family back in the village, how sometimes he worked late into the night just so no one would notice his loneliness. He shared how his secret weighed on him, how he could never confess who he really was to most people without risking ridicule or worse. I shared too. My own fears as a graduate stepping into a world of competition, my nervousness about proving myself, and how even at the party tonight I felt like an outsider. I kept thinking I didn't belong, I admitted, but maybe we all feel that way in different forms. His lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Exactly. We all carry our shadows. Sometimes just knowing that someone else sees them without turning away, it's enough. That night, in that dimly lit changing room, we created something wordless. A bond beyond titles, beyond uniforms, beyond society's expectations. He wasn't just the peon anymore, and I wasn't just the young graduate. For those moments, we were simply two human beings, two souls, who found a fragment of comfort in each other's presence. Eventually I realized I had been gone too long. People might wonder. I rose to leave and he stood as well. His face, usually tired and lined with quiet resignation, now carried a trace of brightness. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening. For being you." I smiled. "And thank you, for trusting me." When I stepped back into the night air, the sound of laughter and splashing water greeted me. The party carried on, oblivious to the quiet exchange that had just reshaped two lives. My friends teased me for disappearing, but I only laughed it off, keeping his secret safe in my heart. In the days that followed, something subtle but beautiful happened. Whenever I passed him in the hallway at the office, he would lower his eyes respectfully but with the faintest flicker of a smile. If I carried files too heavy for me, he appeared suddenly at my side to help, without words. When seniors spoke harshly, he seemed to shield me with his quiet presence, making sure I was never left exposed. No one else noticed the bond and perhaps no one needed to. It was our silent promise. He, the one people overlooked, became my invisible protector. And I, the young graduate still learning the world, carried the responsibility of never treating him as less. One afternoon, weeks after the farmhouse party, I caught him watching me again from across the office yard. But this time, his gaze wasn't the same unsettling stare that had once made me uneasy. It was softer, almost like the gaze of an elder brother watching over his younger sibling. And in that moment, I realized how deeply that night had changed me. Kindness, I thought, is like water. It flows quietly, filling cracks you never knew existed, reshaping lives without fanfare. What began as suspicion and fear had turned into trust, and what could have been a story of misunderstanding became one of quiet respect. Looking back now, I see the party not as just another corporate gathering, but as the place where I learned my first true lesson outside textbooks and degrees, that humanity at its core is about seeing beyond boundaries. And so, our story didn't end with that night, it began there. In laughter shared, in secrets kept safe, in respect that needed no words. A bond beyond boundaries, unspoken yet unbreakable. Months slipped by almost without notice. What once felt like an overwhelming start, the weight of proving myself, the doubt of whether I even belonged in the corporate world, slowly began to settle into rhythm. I found my footing, task by task, presentation by presentation. My late nights filled with spreadsheets, my early mornings with a quiet determination to grow. The CEO, who at first regarded me as just another recruit among dozens, began to take notice. It wasn't anything dramatic, no spotlight, no fanfare. Just the little things. The nod of approval when I completed a project before deadline, the way he began to ask for my input during meetings, the quiet acknowledgement in front of others that I was reliable. Each gesture was a seed of recognition, and I watered them with effort, persistence, and humility. I was no longer just the new graduate. I was slowly becoming part of the fabric of the company. But what warmed me even more was what happened alongside my own growth. The man who had once been invisible to most, the peon I had met that unforgettable night at the farmhouse, also began to be seen differently. It started with small changes. I made it a point never to ignore him, whether in hallways, in the cafeteria, or during office errands. Where others might nod vaguely or not at all, I greeted him warmly. If colleagues were present, I didn't lower my tone or shorten my words. Respect, I believed, must be shown openly, not just whispered in private. At first, people were puzzled. Some smirked, some whispered, some even joked lightly, "Seems like you've made a best friend." But I didn't let their comments sway me. What they didn't know was that his quiet presence had steadied me in ways I couldn't put into words. To me, he wasn't just a uniform moving through corridors. He was the man who had taught me, without teaching, that humanity doesn't wear a designation badge. And something remarkable happened. The more I treated him with dignity, the more others began to follow. It was subtle, but I noticed. Colleagues who once barely looked at him now offered him thanks when he handed out files. Seniors who once spoke sharply now used gentler tones. Even the CEO, perhaps unconsciously, began acknowledging him in ways he hadn't before. Respect, it turned out, was contagious. I remember one afternoon particularly well. I had just finished presenting quarterly progress updates in the conference room. The CEO had praised the clarity of my work, which left me glowing inside. As we stepped out, the peon entered quietly to collect some documents. Before, people would have brushed past him without a glance. But this time, one of the senior managers actually paused, handed him a folder directly and said, "Thank you, bye." The peon's eyes flickered briefly toward me. I caught that look, the mixture of surprise and gratitude, and it filled me with a quiet pride. Not pride in myself alone, but in the fact that dignity could ripple outward like sunlight through a cracked window. From then on, our bond became more than just personal, it became symbolic. In whispered conversations, I overheard newer recruits saying, "If even he can be respected, then maybe this company is different." They didn't realize it, but they were echoing something much deeper. That true leadership is not about commanding authority but about recognizing humanity. For him, life began to change too. People asked about his health, his family, his needs. Once or twice, I even noticed junior employees offering to share lunch with him. He was still the same man, quiet, humble, hardworking, but he no longer carried the invisible weight of being unseen. And in quiet corners of the office, away from curious eyes, our bond held strong. Sometimes he would ask softly, "Are you eating well? Don't skip meals." Other times, he'd just pat my back in passing, like an elder brother reminding me that no matter how far I rose, someone had my back. It was unspoken, but it was powerful. One evening, long after office hours, I sat at my desk finishing a report. He came by to collect the trash bins. I looked up and smiled. "You know," I told him, "things feel different now." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Different for you. You're climbing fast." "No," I said firmly. "Different for us. People see you differently now too." For a long moment he stood there, leaning on the broom handle as though weighing my words. Then he gave me that same look he had the night at the farmhouse, the one that said more than words ever could. "Maybe," he said softly, "but only because you saw me first." Those words stayed with me. Months later, when I think back to that farmhouse night, it feels almost unreal how close I came to misjudging him. What I thought was danger was only a man's longing for connection, his need to be seen, his quiet plea for trust. If I had walked away, if I had let fear dictate my steps, our story would have ended before it began. Instead, it became a beginning. The farmhouse had been filled with lights and laughter, but for me the brightest moment was that quiet room where two strangers discovered each other's humanity. That night changed me more than any promotion or recognition ever could. It taught me that kindness is not weakness, it is strength disguised in gentleness. Today I stand more secure in my role, proud of my work, hopeful for my future. And beside me, not in title, not in hierarchy but in spirit, stands a friend who carries no grand designation but holds a dignity greater than many who do. If someone were to ask me what I learned in my first year at the company, I wouldn't point to spreadsheets, presentations, or quarterly goals. I would simply say, that night at the farmhouse changed my perspective. What I thought would be a moment of fear turned into the beginning of an unlikely friendship, and a reminder that kindness always creates happy endings.